Thank you. My name is Josh. I'm the head of Developer Evangelism at PubNub. Today we're going to talk about the history of developer evangelism, which is sort of an unusual topic. I've never actually seen a session on this before, which is sort of why I wanted to do it. A few months ago, I happened to meet one of our organizers, Christian, at an event in Portland. And as we got to talking, and he said he was working on a conference for developers who make things for other developers. I said, "Tell me more. I've always wanted a conference just like this." We discussed topics, and there were a lot of different things we'd talk about: how to run a hackathon, how to build a good API. But I'm not going to talk about those things today. I realized what I wanted to talk about most for a really long time is the history of our field. As you can tell by the gray hairs in my beard, I've been doing this for a really long time. Come on. Why is it not going to the next slide? There we go. I've been doing this for more than a decade, actually. And in technology, a decade is a really long time. Sometimes I feel like this guy yelling at the damn kids to pipe down and stay off my lawn. I've worked at Sun and Palm and Nokia. I prefer to disown HP after they killed WebOS, but I did technically work there for a while. And I learned a lot about what not to do and what to do, and a lot about what not to do. But I'm not here to teach you about my lessons. I want to talk about the bigger picture of developer evangelism. It's a very unique field. We are both technical and social, a bit of engineering and a bit of marketing, and we don't have degrees for this stuff. I didn't study for this, I just sort of fell into it. I was an engineer who started writing blogs, and blogs led to teaching at a few conferences, and eventually this thing called a developer evangelist. It's a very strange field with a strange name. So I figured it might be interesting to see where we came from. Well, I've been doing this for a long time. The field definitely predates me by a great deal. There's some amazing evangelists I'd like to talk about. Now, before we get started, just what is developer evangelism? According to Wikipedia, it's part of a larger field known as evangelism marketing. This is where you try to inspire your customers to love your product so much that they willingly tell others about it. They voluntarily advocate for you and your product. And this makes sense. Word of mouth has always been a far more effective form of advertising than, a paper ad. But if developer evangelism is more than that, you're more than just making a product for people to use, but for people who use your product, they're using it to make something for others. It's like selling a hammer to a construction team. They aren't using the hammer to build something for themselves, they're using it to build something for somebody else. We are not evangelizing a product, we're evangelizing a tool or a technology. So where did it come from? Who invented it? You probably heard of some of the leaders in our field, like Christian Heilman from Mozilla. He literally wrote a book called Developer Evangelism. Or Scott Hanselman from Microsoft. Now, Scott's amazing. I don't know how he does it. He travels, he speaks, he does a podcast, he has 2 kids and a ridiculous number of Legos. I don't think he sleeps at all. And even if you've never heard of these people, you've probably heard of Guy Kawasaki. He wrote the book on our field about 10 times, and he worked at Apple in the early days of the Macintosh and really kind of set what is the modern developer evangelist. So he must have invented it, right? Well, no. As I dug deeper into the history, I found examples going back to the very earliest days of computing. To really tell the story, we're going to have to go back in time, way back. So let's just pretend we have a time portal. We're going past the start of computers to the late 1700s, ye olden days. We're going to take a look at one of the most important but underrated technologies of the Industrial Revolution. The screw. Now, before the Industrial Revolution, screws were made by hand, often from wood or soft metal. Each screw and nut was created to fit exactly with each other, but not with any others. Interchangeability didn't matter because they were always custom for every job in each machine. They might be the same within one particular machinist, but even then they didn't focus on making them fit very well. Now this started to change. In the 1790s, the first screw cutting lathes made it possible to create metal screws with repeatable sizes. And this greatly lowered the cost of screws, so they exploded in popularity. Much as web frameworks today, everybody created their own standard. Some companies would standardize within the company, but of course they wouldn't standardize outside, because why would you want to share standard with your enemy, with your competitor? And this is pretty much still a problem today. So Different companies had different standards. Different parts of the country had different standards. Different agencies of the government had different standards. It really was chaos, and it was keeping the screw industry down. All that changed. April 21st, 1864, this guy named William Sellers. He gave a talk at the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia. This was the leading technical society of the day. They weren't a pure science institution. They were an applied science institution. They wanted to use reason and mathematics to improve what today we would call engineering. Now, it was already known, Sellers was already known as being an expert machinist. He ran several successful machine shops known in the industry, and he had just become president of the Franklin Institute, and this was his first speech to the members. So he presented a speech called On a Uniform System of Screw Threads, and he laid out a new design for a screw. And the focus was not on technical excellence, but on making it very simple to construct and reuse. He used a 60-degree thread profile, because that was very easy to create with standard triangles, and a flattened tip. Now, while all these features were already in use, he defined every property of the screw in great detail to make construction consistent. And he carefully chose features so that the screws could be made with 2 tools instead of 5. He reasoned that the screws were easier and cheaper to make than the industry would benefit. Now, not everybody was excited about this. Machinists of the era were worried about standardization. They had seen what happened to gunsmiths during the Civil War, where once they were forced to create things compatible with everybody else, their profits evaporated. They were worried this would lead them to commoditization, and they'd have lower wages and no profit. They wanted lock-in to keep customers coming back to them. But William Sellers expected this. So he talked not just about the value of his design, but on the value of standardization itself. He felt that having a standard screw across all the country would help American business compete with the emerging standards coming from Europe. But he also did a little more. Before his speech, he used his connections to get the 4 big machine shops to say they would adopt his standards. His own customers included some of the big railroad companies, so he got them on board. Then he used his connections and influence to build momentum for the standard. After the speech, he traveled around the country, convincing different individual machine shops of the benefits of standardization. Then he used his connections with the Navy to get the Navy to switch to his standard, which eventually spread to all government contracts, eventually forcing all other machine shops to everywhere to update. And though it was originally known as the Sellers thread, it actually became standard as USS, United States Standard Thread, which today we would call SAE, and is still used on all American-style cars. So he won not by making something technically better, though it was, but doing all the legwork to convince people that the standardization itself was important and would benefit everybody. So I would say that he was the first technical evangelist. Now let's skip ahead to early 20th century, World War I and II. These wars really pushed American industry forward. A huge growth in industrial capacity. We developed not only new mechanical and electrical technologies, but new chemical and food technologies as well. New ways of freezing food and dehydrating food for mass consumption. A lot of this was driven by the need to feed millions of soldiers on the battlefield. Spam and glycerin were heavily used during the war, on the battlefield and off. Now, after the war, these companies had a problem. They'd built up all this infrastructure, these big factories, and the war is over now. So they wanted to turn their factories to civilian use and needed to advertise their products to everyday people at a mass scale and encourage people to cook in a different way than they had cooked before the wars, using these new ingredients and new techniques. Laura Shapiro, who's modern day, wrote a book called Something from the Oven, Reinventing Dinner in the 1950s. And she writes that these companies were targeting the housewife specifically because the housewife cooked food for the rest of the family. And so they focused not on the taste of the food, but on ways to help her be modern and efficient, because that was the trends of the day. How to make a cake faster, how to make a soup faster, how to help them do the task of cooking for their family better in some specific way. One of the first companies to do this was Corning. Now, they created this heat-resistant glass by adding boron into traditional silicon. And originally they made this for gas lamps, because gas lamps shattered constantly from the the continued expansion and contraction. And by adding boron, it reduced how much the expansion happened, and so you can go to higher temperatures. In 1915, they started making cookware, but had a really hard time convincing people to use it. This ad from 1936 shows how they were really emphasizing the flames to demonstrate to people that yes, glass could be heated directly with fire and not explode. They also changed the name to Pyrex because in those days adding X to things made people think it was more scientific. To show that this was the future of cooking and that it could be used in virtually anything that was really high quality, they offered to make a 200-inch, and that is 17 feet, glass disc for a new telescope that was being built in California. This was the largest lens ever made at the time, and people would stand by the railways to watch the giant lens travel from New York to California by rail line. Now, when sales were slumping in the 1930s, Corning hired the woman on the left here, Lucy Maltby. She was going to be the voice of the consumer. She looked over the products and suggested changes like adding handles to the bowls so they'd be easier to take out of a hot oven. She set up a new test kitchen and ran a team that did actual field research on their real customers, the housewives who were actually going to cook this stuff. She had the male sales staff do kitchen chores to learn about the customer experience of their female customers. And she simplified the product line to make consumer choice easier. I think we might say that she was the first developer advocate. Now here's another guy. This was the very first television cooking show, 1946. James Beard would later become one of the most famous chefs of the 20th century, created this show called I Love to Eat, using this new medium. And keep in mind, in 1946, there were not that many televisions. And in fact, we don't actually know specifically what he talked about because there's no copies left. While we had live television, we didn't have the ability to record it yet. But we do know that it started with a little skit by Elsie the cow. The whole thing was sponsored by Borden, convincing people to use new dairy products. Then James would take over and start teaching cooking for about 15 minutes. His goal was to get ordinary citizens to cook advanced cuisine. Now, food evangelism became really big in the 1950s. Pillsbury started their bake-off competitions for people who would design and cook their own best recipes. The only requirement was that you use Pillsbury flour. And when it was done, they would publish the results. They would collect all the winning recipes into these recipe books, like you see here. I really call this the very first hackathon. Now, I love this guy, Roy Doty. He made these amazing comic strips starting in 1954 for Popular Science. And he was still doing this until a couple years before his death, up in 2015. Each one of these, and they're called Wordless Workshop because there were no words in them. Each one of these would show how the home builder could make some clever device to solve something, some real world problems they had. In this case, it was how to make a food cover that lets the cats come in and eat their food but keeps the dog out. He drew these for nearly 6 decades, and it was all crowdsourced. People would send in their ideas, and he would flesh them out into these full illustrations, and then pay them for the concept. Now let's get into some actual computer technology. Grace Hopper wrote the very first compiler in 1951 at the UNIVAC Corporation for the A0 language, which was the arithmetic language. 10 minutes? Okay. He thought it would, though it was a compiler, it was more like a linker than what we think of today as a compiler. Keep in mind that in these days, nobody sold software. The machine was very, very expensive, sometimes in the millions of dollars, and you were expected to write your own software for this expensive machine. In 1953, they released an updated version called A2 to their customers, but this time they included the source code. They actually encouraged people to modify the code and send their improvements back to UNIVAC. This may be the very first example of collaborative development in open source software. Now, IBM had their own mainframe, of course. In 1955, a group of users of the IBM 701 computer system decided to create a volunteer-run user group called SHARE. It became a forum for them to exchange technical information about getting the most out of these very expensive machines. And one major resource they created was the SHARE library. It was a collection of patches that people had made to IBM's operating system and became one of the earliest open source libraries. They eventually produced SOS for Share operating system, which is probably the first fully open source operating system. Amazingly, Share still exists today. They have over 20,000 members across 2,000 companies that still use current versions of IBM's giant mainframes. Now let's jump to the late 70s. In the very early stages of the PC revolution, the Apple I was being sold, and they were working on the Apple II. IBM wouldn't launch the PC for a couple years, but everyone started to see how these tiny computers could really upend the market for mini computers, which were these giant refrigerator-sized things. And I want to tell you about this guy named Stan Veit. Stan had an independent computer store selling the early Apples and a few other computers. And one day, he gets a visit at his store from Charles Tandy, who's the guy who owned Radio Shack. They had something like 10,000 stores around the country. So they take Stan to the Tandy factory, and he sees a prototype of the TRS-80. Their vision is to vastly increase the number of computers sold each year by making the TRS-80 very cheap and accessible, which is why they wanted Stan. Now, Stan runs his computer store differently than other people. Instead of trying to sell people on a particular piece of hardware, he tries to find out what they need and guides them to the best option. Charles Tandy said they'd visited other computer stores and found that they fit into two types. The first type were stores run by computer hobbyists who would basically ignore anybody who was a newbie. The second type were run by ex-used car salesmen who would just try to get the person to buy whatever was the most expensive possible thing. They would completely snow the average buyer. But Charles felt that at Stan's store, they didn't fit either of these two types. They would meet the customer at whatever level they were and help them get the right thing. Stan said that most of his salespeople had come from the hobbyist ranks, but he'd given them some retail training so they'd be the best of both worlds. In the end, Charles tried to buy Stan's store and have Stan train all of Radio Shack's managers around the TRS-80, but Stan decided to stay independent. I like to think of him as the first customer advocate. He saw the vision. He knew that PCs would change the future and wanted to make sure that the industry did it right. Go check out his site at pchistory.org. He has tons of amazing stories about the early days of computing, including when he gave some CES booth space to two crazy hippies named Steve. He also was editor-in-chief of Computer Shopper and became sysop of the first online magazine at CompuServe. So now we're going to get to Apple. This picture shows a reunion of Apple's 4 original developer evangelists. These guys were instrumental in making the Mac become the computer that made computing accessible to the masses. So we'll start with Mike Bosich. Mike was the tech evangelist for Apple during the Apple II days. He persuaded developers to write for the Apple II. One of the original developers he was working with was named Mark Barton. Now, Mark was a software genius. He figured out how to make the Apple II do actual speech synthesis, writing a program called SAM, which is short for Software Automatic Mouth. So Mike encouraged Mark to port it to the Mac. This is before the Mac had been announced. And then he pulled Mark and Steve Jobs in a new room to show it off. Steve immediately said Apple had to have this. It would let the Mac be the first computer that would actually introduce itself. So Apple bought SAM, renamed it Macintalk, which is built into every Mac computer ever sold. Even the modern voice technology in OS X is a direct descendant of that original product. So Mike, as a developer evangelist, was instrumental in improving the product that he evangelized. Now, around the time the Mac was going to come out, he hired his old college roommate to be a software evangelist for the Mac. This guy was named Guy Kawasaki, who ended up being the chief evangelist at Apple for 4 years. And Guy really defined what I think of as the modern developer evangelist. He traveled around the world convincing people to build software for the Mac. He found the people who most loved Apple because it helped them be successful. The graphic designers, the small database companies, people who were empowered by using Apple's products. He tried to make these people successful, and he rewarded them with t-shirts, with meetups, visits by employees. He would often say that evangelism is selling a dream, the dream of what people can do with their technology, not the technology itself. I feel like he really set the rules of the modern technical evangelist. He proposed these set of principles that I think still form the core of what we do. First, you have to create a cause. This meaning start with a good product, something that actually improves the lives of the people who use it. Without a good product, the rest doesn't matter. Then you have to love the cause. Being a developer evangelist is kind of a way of life. You have to totally love the product and want to spread the good news. If you don't love something, you can't sell it. Look for agnostics. Ignore the atheists. It's very hard to convert someone who has made up their mind to use a competitor's product. Instead, look for the people who haven't made up their mind yet. At PubNub, we found that our biggest challenge isn't our competitors. The biggest challenge is the people don't know what our category is, that it exists, and why they would want to use it. Once we sell them on the concept of using a data stream network, then selling them on our particular product is easy. Localize the pain. I love this one. Don't talk in big flowery words, and don't talk about a tech revolution or a paradigm shift. People don't buy revolutions. People buy aspirin for their headache. Find out, this is your job as an evangelist, find out where your customer's pain is and help them solve it. Then let people test drive the cause. Don't try to convince them that your product is best. Make it easier for them to test drive it and see for themselves that it's good. Then learn to give a demo. You have to give a good demo, and that means practice, practice, practice. You can't evangelize a product if you can't show a product. Make sure the first step is as easy as possible. Someone shouldn't have to re-architect their whole infrastructure just to use your stuff. At PubNub, we brag that we can hook our entire system up in 10 lines of code in less than 5 minutes. We want to make that initial barrier to entry be really low. Don't focus on the big titles or reputations. Meet with anybody who will listen to you, even if it's a small group, if it's an individual. The line programmer is probably more likely to want your help than the CTO. Don't ever lie. Not only is lying morally and ethically wrong, it's really hard to keep track of. If you always tell the truth, then there's only one story to keep track of. If you don't know the answer to a question, don't lie and make something up. Just honestly say, I don't know the answer to that, but I will find out and get back to you. And remember your friends. Be nice to the people you meet on the way up, because you're going to meet them on the way back down later. People who've worked with you in the past, the people who've used your stuff before, are the most likely to want to use your stuff again. Now, I could really talk about Guy Kawasaki for hours, and he's written so many cool books. I'll just leave you this website. It's full of tons of interesting stories, and he's still doing this work for other startups. It's amazing. Now, I want to leave you with this. One of my favorite authors is Kathy Sierra. She was a master trainer for Java at Sun, and she created the Head First series of technical books. These books had a very unorthodox way of teaching technical topics. They had jokes and puzzles in them. They were very visual, very intense. I love these books. And on her blog, she would often talk about how you should help users kick ass. Users don't care about how awesome you are, or how many awards you've won. They care about how you can make them be better. In my mind, this is really the essence of developer evangelism, helping people kick ass. This is why we do what we do. So to make a long story short, I think it's important to know the history of our field. It's far older and richer than I realized when I started this research. But amazingly, the core principles haven't changed. From the simple screw to the modern web framework, we always have to consider how people are going to use the things that we build and what their needs are. When you help people kick ass, they will love your product and share the good news with everyone. So if you're thinking of joining the ranks of developer evangelism, know that you're joining a long and illustrious tradition of helping people do amazing things. And only by remembering our history can we build the future. Thank you.